Welcome to Finance Empire Real Life Stories. Before we begin today's emotional journey, I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine your child coming home quieter than usual. Imagine noticing bruises they try to hide. Imagine watching their confidence slowly disappear while another child enjoys making them suffer every single day. Now imagine finally gathering the courage to meet the bully's parents, hoping that mature adults will help solve the problem peacefully. But instead of finding understanding, you discover something terrifying. The child is not the real bully. The real bully is sitting across the table wearing a suit and calling himself a parent. Today's story is about fear, courage, family, and the painful realization that some adults never grow beyond cruelty. It is also a story about standing your ground when nobody else wants to speak up. As always, this lesson will help you improve your English listening skills, emotional vocabulary, and real-life communication phrases, while taking you through a deeply human story, filled with tension, emotion, and powerful life lessons. So dim the lights, relax, and step into the story of Mark and Leo. The morning sky was grey and heavy with clouds when Mark parked his car outside Westbrook Elementary School. The windshield reflected his worried expression back at him as he adjusted his tie for the third time. He hated these meetings, not because he was afraid of confrontation, but because he still believed problems between children should never reach this point. On the passenger seat beside him sat a folded piece of paper from the school administration. Parental mediation session. Such clean and professional words for something so ugly. Mark stared at the school building and thought about Leo's bruised ribs. He thought about the trembling voice his son used when he finally admitted the truth. Silas Vance had been tormenting him for months, pushing him during soccer practice, stealing his lunch, mocking the way he talked, calling him weak. Mark remembered how hard Leo tried not to cry while explaining everything. That memory alone made Mark's chest tighten with anger. Still, he wanted to believe in adults. He wanted to believe that reasonable people could sit down together and fix things calmly. He had no idea that belief was about to be shattered. Inside the school office, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The counsellor, Mrs. Gable, greeted him politely and motioned toward the small meeting room. Mark sat down and opened his notebook. He had prepared carefully. He had written important phrases to keep himself calm during the discussion. Safety, respect, accountability, resolution. He repeated the words silently like a prayer. Then the door opened. Jeff Vance entered first. The man filled the doorway with his broad shoulders and aggressive posture. Behind him walked his wife Sarah, dressed perfectly, staring down at her phone with complete disinterest. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them apologized. Jeff sat heavily in the chair across from Mark and sighed dramatically. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. Mark stood and offered his hand politely. "Hello, I'm Mark, Leo's father." Jeff glanced at the hand but refused to shake it. "I know exactly who you are," he replied coldly. Mrs. Gable attempted a nervous smile. "We're all here to find a healthy solution for the boys." Jeff snorted loudly. "Healthy solution? My son's not the problem. Maybe your kid just needs thicker skin." The words hit Mark like ice water. For a moment he genuinely thought he had misunderstood. Surely no parent would react this way after hearing another child was injured. But then Jeff leaned back casually and crossed his arms. "Boys fight," he continued. "That's life. My son's strong. If your kid can't handle competition, maybe sports aren't for him." Mark felt something shift deep inside him. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not denial. This was pride. The counsellor cleared her throat carefully. "Mr. Vance, physical aggression and repeated targeting are serious concerns." Jeff shrugged. "Maybe Leo should stop acting like prey." Mark slowly lowered his notebook onto the table. Suddenly Leo's stories made horrifying sense. The sheep comments, the predator jokes, the obsession with dominance. Silas wasn't inventing these ideas. He was learning them at home. Mark looked directly at Sarah for the first time, hoping perhaps she would show concern. Instead, she finally looked up from her phone and said calmly, "The world rewards strong people, Mark. We're preparing our son for reality." Mark stared at her in disbelief. "You're teaching him cruelty," he said quietly. Jeff immediately leaned forward. "No," he snapped. "We're teaching him to win." The room became unbearably tense. Mrs. Gable tried desperately to calm everyone down, but Mark already understood the truth. This meeting would solve nothing. You cannot negotiate kindness with people who view empathy as weakness. Mark stood slowly. "We're done here," he said firmly. Jeff smirked as Mark walked toward the door. "Maybe teach your boy not to cry so much," he called out mockingly. Mark kept walking, but his hands trembled with restrained anger. Outside the school building, cold air hit his face like a slap. He stood beside his car for several long seconds, trying to steady himself. The image of Leo's frightened eyes flashed through his mind again and again. Mark realized something painful in that moment. The problem was much bigger than an 8-year-old bully. The problem was a grown man teaching his child that power mattered more than kindness. And people like that rarely stop on their own. That afternoon, Leo climbed into the back seat, after school unusually quietly. Mark looked into the rearview mirror. "How was your day?" Leo hesitated before reaching into his backpack. He handed Mark a folded paper covered in crude handwriting. The drawing showed a sheep with glasses crying on the ground. Across the top were the words, "Snitch family." Mark's stomach dropped. "What happened?" Leo stared out the window. "Silas told everybody our parents had a meeting. He said his dad called us weak." Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter. The Vances had actually gone home and mocked the mediation in front of their child. They had turned accountability into entertainment. That night, Mark barely slept. Around midnight, he noticed headlights outside the house. He peeked through the blinds. Jeff Vance's black SUV sat parked across the street. Jeff himself was behind the wheel, staring directly at the house with a smug expression. Then he slowly smiled before driving away. A message without words. Intimidation. Mark suddenly understood the real game being played. Jeff relied on fear. Fear kept teachers quiet. Fear kept parents isolated. Fear allowed people like him to dominate entire communities. But as Mark sat in the darkness staring at the empty street, another realization formed slowly in his mind. Fear only works when people feel alone. The next day, Mark took Leo somewhere unexpected after school, a martial arts gym. Leo looked nervous immediately. "I don't want to become mean like Silas," he whispered. Mark knelt beside him gently. "This isn't about becoming mean," he said. "It's about learning that you don't have to be afraid anymore." Inside the gym, they met Coach Silver, a calm older man with observant eyes. After hearing the situation, Silver nodded thoughtfully. "Bullies feed on fear," he explained. "Confidence changes everything." Leo's first class was awkward. He stumbled during warm-ups. He struggled with the movements. But little by little, something changed. By the end of practice, Leo stood straighter. His voice sounded steadier. For the first time in months, Mark saw a spark returning to his son's eyes. Meanwhile, Mark began fighting his own battle. Not with fists, with evidence. Every evening he documented incidents carefully. Dates, witnesses, photos, threats. He emailed school board members directly, bypassing the principal who protected Jeff through personal friendships. Then Mark started quietly speaking with other parents. At first, most were hesitant. Nobody wanted conflict with Jeff Vance. The man owned businesses throughout town. He intimidated people easily. But once one parent spoke honestly, others followed. Stories emerged everywhere. Children being threatened, families pressured into silence, teachers privately admitting fear of retaliation. A hidden network of victims slowly revealed itself. Mark realized Jeff's greatest weapon had never been strength. It was isolation. People believed they were alone, and alone people stay silent. But together was different. Weeks later, during the annual school field day, everything finally exploded. Children ran across the grass laughing, while parents gathered nearby watching games and races. Leo stood with several new friends near the soccer field. Mark noticed immediately how different his son looked now. Confident, relaxed, present. Then Silas approached. The sneer on his face was instantly recognizable. "Hey, sheep," he mocked loudly. "Still hiding behind your daddy?" Several nearby parents turned uncomfortably. Silas stepped closer aggressively. "My dad says weak people deserve what happens to them." Leo took a deep breath, then calmly replied, "Your dad's wrong." Silas looked shocked. Bullies expect fear, not calmness. Furious, Silas shoved Leo hard. But this time Leo reacted differently. Using the training coach Silver taught him, Leo stepped aside smoothly and redirected Silas safely onto the grass without hurting him. The crowd gasped. Jeff Vance exploded instantly. You little brat! He stormed across the field toward Leo in pure rage, but before he could reach the children, Mark stepped directly in front of him. And he wasn't alone. Other parents stepped beside him too. One by one. Quiet parents. Fearful parents. Parents who were finally tired of silence. Phones appeared recording everything. Jeff looked around and for the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. The predator suddenly realized the crowd was no longer afraid. The school board investigation moved quickly after that. Evidence poured in from multiple families. Witness statements, videos, emails, threats. The protection Jeff relied upon collapsed under public scrutiny. A week later, moving trucks arrived outside the Vance house. The neighborhood watched quietly as boxes disappeared into the trucks one by one. No cheering, no celebration, only relief. On the final morning before the Vances left town, Leo stood by the kitchen window watching silently. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. You okay? Leo nodded slowly. I feel bad for Silas, he admitted quietly. Imagine growing up thinking cruelty makes you strong. Mark looked at his son with deep pride. Despite everything, Leo had protected the most important part of himself, his kindness, and that was true strength. As they drove to school that morning, sunlight finally broke through the clouds overhead. For the first time in months, Leo laughed freely in the passenger seat. Mark smiled softly, realizing something important. He had started this journey trying to fix another family. But in the end, the real victory was protecting his own. Because sometimes standing your ground is not about defeating enemies. It is about teaching the people you love that they never have to shrink themselves to survive. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to become cruel in a cruel world. Thank you for joining today's emotional story on Finance Empire Real Life Stories. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to ask yourself an important question. What kind of example do we set for the next generation every single day? Because children are always watching. They learn strength from us. They learn kindness from us. And sadly, sometimes they learn cruelty from us too. In our next story, we'll explore another emotional, real-life situation involving betrayal, trust, and a decision that changes an entire family forever. So stay tuned, keep practicing your English, and remember this powerful lesson. Real strength is not about making others afraid of you. Real strength is making others feel safe around you. See you in the next story. Mark sat alone in the quiet living room, long after Leo had gone to sleep. The house felt peaceful again, but his mind was still restless. The events of the past few weeks replayed in his head like scenes from a movie he couldn't pause. The bruise on Leo's ribs, the cruel laughter in the counsellor's office, Jeff Vance standing in the grocery store aisle like a man who believed fear was a form of power. And then the field day, where everything finally changed. Mark leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. For the first time in a long while, the silence inside the house didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. He thought about how close he had come to losing control. There had been moments when anger burned so hot inside his chest that he wanted to fight Jeff the same way Jeff fought everyone else, with intimidation, threats, and aggression. It would have been easy to become consumed by revenge. Easy to teach Leo that the only way to survive cruel people was to become cruel yourself. But that wasn't the lesson he wanted his son to carry into adulthood. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows while Leo quietly ate cereal at the table. His backpack rested beside the chair, no longer looking like a burden too heavy for a child to carry. You okay, buddy? Mark asked gently. Leo nodded before taking another bite. Yeah, he said softly. It feels weird, though. What feels weird? School being normal again. Mark understood exactly what he meant. When fear becomes part of your daily life, peace can almost feel suspicious at first. Your body stays tense even after the danger disappears. Mark sat across from his son and wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. You know something important? He asked. Leo looked up. You were never weak. Leo looked down at the cereal bowl. But Silas said, I know what he said. Mark interrupted carefully. But bullies say things to make themselves feel powerful. Strong people don't need to humiliate others. Leo stayed quiet for a moment before asking the question that had clearly been sitting in his mind for weeks. Why was Jeff so mean? Mark sighed slowly. How do you explain bitterness to a child? How do you explain adults who never learned how to deal with their own anger? Some people grow older without growing wiser, Mark answered. They think being loud means being strong. They think making other people afraid gives them control. But deep down, people like that are usually scared themselves. Leo stirred his spoon through the milk, thoughtfully. So Silas learned it from his dad? Mark nodded slowly. Most children learn how to treat others by watching the adults around them. That sentence stayed in the air between them for several quiet seconds. Then Leo smiled faintly. I'm glad I learned from you instead. Mark felt emotion tighten in his throat so suddenly that he couldn't speak for a moment. Out of everything that had happened, those words mattered more than any victory against Jeff Vance. Because this was never truly about winning a battle against another family. It was about protecting the kind of person Leo would become. Later that afternoon, Mark picked Leo up from a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practice. This time, Leo jogged out of the building with confidence instead of hesitation. His shoulders were relaxed. His eyes were brighter. Coach Silver walked beside him carrying a rolled-up training mat. Your son is improving quickly, Silver said with a smile. But the best part isn't his technique, it's his discipline. Mark looked proudly at Leo. What do you mean? He asked. Silver crossed his arms thoughtfully. Some kids come here because they want revenge, the coach explained. They want to hurt the people who embarrass them. But Leo doesn't train with anger. He trains with focus. Leo shrugged shyly. I just don't want to feel scared anymore. Coach Silver nodded approvingly. And that's the real purpose of strength, he said. Not domination, freedom. The word lingered in Mark's mind during the drive home. Freedom. That was exactly what Leo had gained. Not freedom from difficult people, because difficult people will always exist somewhere in life, but freedom from believing he was helpless. A few days later, Mark received an unexpected phone call while organising paperwork at his office desk. Hello, Mr. Carter, a nervous voice asked. Yes. This is Principal Harris from Brookside Elementary. Mark straightened immediately. The principal cleared his throat awkwardly. I wanted to personally apologise for how the situation with Silas Vance was handled. Mark stayed silent, allowing the man to continue. There were mistakes made, Harris admitted carefully. The school should have acted sooner. We failed to recognise the seriousness of the pattern. Mark looked out the office window at the busy street below. For weeks he had wanted this apology, but now that it finally arrived, it didn't feel as satisfying as he once imagined. You didn't just fail to recognise it, Mark said calmly. You ignored it. The principal hesitated. You're right. Mark rubbed his forehead tiredly. There are kids sitting in classrooms right now who are terrified to speak up because they think adults won't protect them, he continued. That has to change. It will, Harris promised quickly. We're implementing new reporting procedures and staff training. Mark hoped the man meant it, because the truth was painfully simple. Bullies survive when good people stay quiet. That evening, Leo sat at the kitchen table working on homework, while soft music played from a speaker nearby. Mark cooked dinner quietly, occasionally glancing toward his son. Everything looked ordinary, and after everything they had endured, ordinary suddenly felt precious. Dad? Leo asked suddenly. Yeah. Do you think Silas hates me? Mark stopped chopping vegetables and considered the question carefully. No, he answered honestly. I think Silas probably hates the way he feels inside sometimes. Leo frowned slightly. But he was always angry. Angry people usually are hurting somewhere underneath, Mark explained. Leo stared at his math worksheet thoughtfully. Then why didn't anyone help him? The question hit Mark hard, because beneath all the conflict and fear, there was another sad truth. Silas was also a child raised inside a house where cruelty was praised instead of corrected. A child taught that empathy was weakness and intimidation was strength. Mark realised then that while Leo had escaped becoming a victim, Silas was still trapped becoming someone he might regret later in life. I don't know, Mark admitted softly, but someday he'll have to decide what kind of man he wants to become. The room grew quiet again except for the scratching sound of Leo's pencil. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. For the first time in weeks, the house felt safe enough for reflection instead of survival. As the days passed, the story of the Vances slowly faded from neighbourhood conversation. Another family moved into the empty house down the street. The black SUV stopped appearing on corners. The tension disappeared little by little. But the lessons remained. Mark noticed small changes in Leo. He laughed more freely now. He raised his hand more confidently during soccer practice. He even began helping another shy student at school, who often ate lunch alone. One afternoon, Mark watched from the parking lot as Leo stood beside the smaller boy near the playground fence. Two older kids approached them aggressively. For a split second, Mark's protective instincts surged again, but then he saw Leo calmly step between the boys and speak firmly without fear. The older kids eventually walked away, not because Leo threatened them, not because he fought them, but because confidence changes the energy of a situation. Leo climbed into the car afterward, looking completely relaxed. "What happened over there?" Mark asked casually. Leo shrugged. "They were making fun of Ethan because he stutters. And I told them to stop." Mark smiled slightly. "What if they didn't stop?" Leo looked out the window thoughtfully. "Then I would have handled it." There was no arrogance in his voice, no desire for violence, just quiet certainty. Mark realized then that courage isn't loud. Real courage rarely screams or threatens. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. That night, Mark stood outside on the back porch while the cool evening wind moved through the trees. Life finally felt stable again. Not perfect, not easy, but steady. He thought about how quickly fear can spread through a family when cruelty enters the door. And he thought about how powerful love becomes when people stand together instead of retreating into silence. The world would always contain people like Vance. People who mistake intimidation for leadership. People who try to dominate because they never learned how to connect. But the world also contained people like Coach Silver, like Elena from the cafe, like the parents who finally stopped whispering and started standing together. And maybe most importantly, the world contained kids like Leo, children capable of becoming compassionate, even after experiencing cruelty. Mark looked through the kitchen window and saw Leo laughing while trying to teach himself a complicated card trick from an online video. Just a kid again, not a victim, not a frightened child hiding bruises, just a boy rediscovering peace. Mark smiled quietly to himself. The battle with the Vances had ended, but a far more important journey had begun. The journey of raising a child who understood that strength and kindness were never enemies. And somewhere deep inside, Mark knew that lesson would protect Leo far longer than fear ever could. Because bullies may win moments, but character wins lifetimes. And in the end, the loudest people are rarely the strongest ones in the room. The strongest people are the ones who remain kind after life gives them every reason not to be. That was the lesson Mark hoped Leo would carry forever.